Is Mexico currently too dangerous to visit?
Passengers on the flight leaving Culiacan, Mexico, got caught in the middle of a fight between the Mexican government and a drug cartel. They ducked for cover as gunshots rang out.
Burning vehicles, blocked roads, and violent gang battles.
Andamos con miedo porque vamos a hacer nomás esperando que Dios guarde y pase otra cosa.
Let's talk. Just a couple of days ago, lots and lots of violence has been happening in the state of Sinaloa, specifically in the city of Culiacan. But why? Well, it is because the son of El Chapo has recently been arrested. Now, if you don't know who El Chapo is,
Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. You've probably heard the name before. Man who's gone down in modern history as one of the biggest drug kingpins.
now he was arrested several years ago and is currently in jail in the US. When leaders of cartels, when leaders of gangs, when leaders of, we'll say, violent organizations get arrested here in Mexico, there tends to be repercussions locally, meaning the rest of the group, the rest of the cartel, etc., tend to let their displeasure be known in violent ways, usually directed to the police or government specifically. And so, of course, when the leader of one of the biggest cartels in Mexico gets arrested, yes, a huge wave of violence happens.
The Mexican city in the northwest heartland of the Sinaloa cartel has descended into a battleground, a reaction to the arrest of Ovidio Guzman, son of the infamous drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The clashes have left 10 members of the security forces and 19 from the cartel dead.
And I don't know if it has died down yet.
In Culiacan today, the situation was relatively calm, with some shops open despite warnings from the government for people not to venture outside.
Todavía se siente pues inseguridad, o sea, todavía no hay como que nadie da algo que diga ya está todo bien, o sea, no sé, todavía no se siente bien.
And so there's lots of travel advisories where people are saying don't go to Mexico at this time. And lots of people make fun of the US travel advisory, but I thought this would be a great time for me to just show you what the US travel advisory says. And as somebody who's been living in Mexico for the last 3 years, since 2019, only 2 states have changed conditions. There are 4 travel advisory levels, 1 being the lowest, meaning there's no concern, and 4 being the worst, and it literally means do not travel here. Mexico is predominantly a 2. Exercise increased caution, and this has always been. The only changes made in 2021, which I was super excited about, is that the state of Yucatan and the state of Campeche, which is right next to the Yucatan, for the first time in a while became condition 1, which is basically that you're totally fine. And most people know that, for example, Mérida is considered the safest city in Mexico. Since 2019, and I'm sure longer than that, there have been 6 states in Mexico that have been in the do not travel category. And it's pretty much due to crime and kidnapping. The 6 states are Colima, Guerrero, Michoacan, Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, I feel like I'm pronouncing that super wrong, and Zacatecas. So those are the 6 states that the US says just don't travel to.
Have the discernment to know when to just say no.
And you'll see Sinaloa, which is where the most recent violence has happened, has been on the list of don't go there for a long time. Then there are 7 states that are reconsider travel to, and then after that it becomes states that are just exercise precautions, right? Like don't be an idiot. You should always keep your eyes open. And then real quick, I wanted to show you just a map of Mexico. So this is a current map of do and do not go types of locations. So the red, we'll notice that Colima, Guerrero, Michoacan, very close together, right? Kind of makes sense. And then Sinaloa, Zacatecas, Tamaulipas are the other 6 states that you're recommended not to travel to. And each state, if I were to click on each of those states, they probably have a small portion, an area that is considered safe to travel to, whether they recommend you only travel there by air, whether they say it's okay to travel there via land. But either way, generally speaking, the state is considered not safe for normal foreign travel, but there's usually often exceptions to the rules. And so, for example, if we look at the state of Sinaloa, Culiacan, which is where the violence has been erupting, and Mazatlan, which is a tourist destination, is a 2.5-hour drive away. They're not necessarily close together. Right now, I think would be a ridiculously silly time to purposely go to Sinaloa, to even visit Mazatlan. I just think when you know there's active violence in a state, Mexico is large enough to where you can find somewhere else in Mexico to visit instead. But places like Yucatan, Campeche, and all of these yellow regions are considered relatively safe. Again, even in a green location like Merida, just because there's no travel advisory there does not mean that there's literally no crime going on. But yeah, Mexico for the most part is safe. There are parts of Mexico we recommend you do not go to, and especially for myself, single mom traveling with my son, I'm gonna be extremely cautious of visiting places that are in any of the red areas. And honestly, I probably will one day go to Morelia because I just hear such great things about it.
Hola, bienvenidos.
Welcome to beautiful Morelia.
But when it comes to traveling to Mexico, you just constantly hear, now's not a great time to travel to Mexico, there's all this violence. Well, okay, let's be more specific. Now's probably not a great time to visit Sinaloa, which arguably it maybe is never a great time to visit Sinaloa, with the exception perhaps of Mazatlan. And of course, probably super annoying to hear, but from an American viewpoint, there are many parts of the US that are considered unsafe, and yet we live there. For example, my son and I lived in Jacksonville, Florida, the murder capital of Florida. And so there are definitely parts of Jacksonville, Florida that you never want to visit. However, the areas that I frequented, the areas I lived in, I would say was pretty safe. I never worried about violent crimes happening near me. So just kind of to give you a perspective that yes, there are definitely parts of Mexico you probably do not want to live in or visit, but most of Mexico honestly is safe. Did you know that Cancun is actually considered one of the most violent places to live in Mexico? That actually kind of shocked me. But my point is this: wherever you go, whether it's Mexico, the US, or any part of the world, always keep your head on a swivel. I think it's smart to at least take a glance at travel advisories. And when I say take a glance, sometimes it might say that the entire state is a do not travel to, but especially if that place calls to you, it might benefit you to click on that link and see a little more detail. And you might realize maybe why certain parts are considered more violent than others and what part of the state you might want to live in. And so I hope that clarified whether Mexico is safe or not. So the ultimate answer is it depends, but for the most part, there's a high chance the particular location you want to go to in Mexico is perfectly safe. And so you want to be very wary when somebody makes a statement like, don't visit this entire country. Mexico is a good enough size to where you'll want to take a minute and look a little closer. Okay, I wanted to come on here and just mention a quick, interesting observation, but before I do, disclaimer, this is not to say that the cartel is in any way, shape, or form, good or honorable or not extraordinarily dangerous. Absolutely recommend avoiding cartels or anything in the gang violence category. That just is a recipe for disaster. But isn't it interesting that when El Chapo's son got arrested on Thursday, of course, as we can predict, the cartel will respond, but specifically they're responding to get him back. And so immediately upon arrest, that's when the violence happened. Blockades were happening, vehicles were burning, very, very scary and violent situation. And as I've mentioned before, anytime there's gunshots, whether it's aimed at you or aimed in the air, those bullets land somewhere. This is not a good thing. But isn't it curious? In all of this violence, we have, I believe current numbers are 10 members of the Mexican army were killed. I believe 35 were reported injured. 19 cartel members were killed. We do not know how many might have been injured, and 0 civilians injured. 0 civilians injured. I just want to mention that that's interesting to me. Now again, as a civilian living in Sinaloa, and especially if you happen to live in Culiacan, it's got to be terrifying to live there, even if you're not the direct target. Stray bullets can still do lots of damage, and of course, buildings and vehicles have definitely been destroyed. So it's not like the civilians had 0 loss, right? There are also 2 major airports in the state, one in Culiacan itself and the other one in Mazatlan, and both airports were shut down. You can probably imagine why, as well as blockades all around the state so that nobody came and went. So lots of scary things happening. There was even actually some, I'm gonna just say, military activity happening in Mazatlan where members of the military did what looked like a diving exercise where they came in from the waters out onto the Mazatlan beaches, literally interrupting tourists. So must have been a very frightening thing to observe. But to my knowledge, I could be wrong, no actual violence happened in Mazatlan. It's just that the airports were closed. And of course, probably the entire state is seeing soldiers everywhere. So very scary moment. And as a tourist, anytime you find out that your method of leaving has been stopped, right? The airport was closed. That's just a terrifying thing to not be able to leave the state, right? So very scary all around for the entire state, but to me, super curious that the only people that were actually killed or injured was part of either the cartel or the Mexican army.